the silence, hear the cry, moonlit tears descending sky, creeping footsteps near and far, lost souls seek where voices are. Echoes in the night, fading from our sight, whispering their fears, drowning in our tears.
It started with a phone call at 2:17 a.m. Samantha jolted awake, her heart pounding in the dark. The ringtone cut through the quiet like a jagged blade. She squinted at her phone, her brother's name on the screen. Confused, she answered.
Sam?
Jason's voice crackled through the line, weak and distorted.
Can you hear me?
Jason, what's wrong?
Silence.
Jason?
A low, ragged breath wheezed on the other end, followed by something that sounded like footsteps, faint but deliberate. Then the call disconnected. Samantha stared at her phone, the dark screen reflecting her wide-eyed face. She tried calling back, but it went straight to voicemail. Her pulse quickened as she sat up in bed, the room suddenly colder. She hadn't spoken to her brother in almost 3 years. They'd had a falling out after their mother died. Jason never coped with the loss, spiraling into paranoia and seclusion. He'd cut off all contact, and Samantha had reluctantly accepted his distance. But hearing his voice again, in the middle of the night, brought an unsettling weight. Samantha threw on a hoodie and headed to her kitchen, trying to shake the feeling. The apartment felt too quiet. She opened the fridge, hoping a glass of water would calm her nerves, when the phone rang again. She jumped, nearly dropping the glass. It was Jason again. Her hand trembled as she answered.
Jason, what is going on? You're scaring me.
Sam? His voice was faint, almost a whisper now.
Don't let them in.
Who? What are you talking about?
Again, the call ended abruptly. The air in the room seemed to thicken, and an icy shiver ran down her spine. What had happened to Jason? She thought about calling the police, but wasn't even sure where Jason was living these days. They had completely lost touch. She sat down on the couch, clutching her phone, staring at it as if waiting for another call. The minutes dragged by, the silence oppressive, pushing against her chest. Something wasn't right. Then came the knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Samantha froze, her mind racing. No one ever came to her apartment this late. The building was secure. You needed to be buzzed in, and she hadn't heard the intercom. The knocks came again, louder this time. Her breath caught in her throat as she stood up, her legs shaky. She tiptoed to the door, pressing her eye to the peephole. But the hallway outside was empty. Her heart pounded in her ears. She stood there for a long moment, waiting, her breath shallow. Maybe it was her neighbor, she thought. The older woman who lived across the hall sometimes knocked when she needed help with her groceries. But at 2:30 in the morning, another knock, this time so loud it rattled the door. Samantha's body locked up, her hand hovering over the doorknob, her instincts screaming at her not to open it. Slowly, she backed away, but then she heard something. A voice. It was Jason's voice, muffled but unmistakable.
Sam, let me in.
She stumbled backward, her skin prickling with cold terror. He wasn't here. He couldn't be. He'd sounded so far away on the phone. This didn't make sense. The voice called again, softer this time.
Please, Sam.
Her hand twitched toward the knob. Every muscle in her body torn between wanting to open the door and the overwhelming sense of dread that told her not to. But then the knocking stopped. For a long time, there was nothing. No voice, no movement. The apartment seemed to settle back into an eerie calm, but the tension in her chest didn't ease. She slowly moved to the window, her hands shaking as she pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The street was empty, but she saw a figure standing across the road, barely visible under the streetlight. Her breath hitched. It was Jason. He stood perfectly still, staring up at her window, his face hidden in shadow. Something about his posture, rigid, unnatural, set off alarm bells in her mind. Her phone buzzed again. Another call from Jason. She hesitated before answering.
Sam, let me in.
His voice was clearer now but flat, devoid of emotion.
I'm right here. Open the door.
She glanced back at the door and then again at the figure across the street. Her heart raced, panic flooding her senses.
Why are you doing this?
She whispered, her voice barely audible. The line crackled, then his voice came again, cold and empty.
I'm not outside, Sam. I've never been outside.
The figure across the street tilted its head unnaturally, almost as if it had heard him too. Samantha's stomach dropped as the reality of it began to sink in. That thing across the street, it wasn't Jason. It couldn't be. Suddenly, the door behind her rattled violently, as if something on the other side was pounding it with inhuman force. Her phone slipped from her hand, and her vision blurred as the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. The pounding grew louder, and through the noise, she could still hear Jason's voice, now a faint echo in her mind, repeating the same chilling words over and over.
I've never been outside.
And with a final deafening crash, the door burst open. Samantha never had time to scream. Whatever stood there, silhouetted against the darkness, had her brother's voice, but nothing else human remained. The last thing she heard before everything went black was a whisper.
Let me in.
Samantha awoke, gasping for air. She was sprawled on the cold floor of her apartment, her body drenched in sweat, the door wide open. Her heart thudded in her chest, but everything was still. Too still. She scrambled to her feet, her hands trembling as she slammed the door shut. The chain lock rattled uselessly. Whatever had forced its way in had done more than simply break the door. It had broken something in the air, something that now felt wrong. Samantha's eyes darted around the apartment, searching for any signs of the intruder, but nothing seemed out of place. The furniture was untouched, the windows unbroken, but the silence was overwhelming, pressing against her ears like cotton stuffed deep in her skull. Her phone was still lying on the floor where she had dropped it. She snatched it up, her fingers fumbling to dial 911. As she brought the phone to her ear, a low hum crackled from the receiver. The line was dead. Suddenly, a strange sound echoed from behind her, a low whispering, soft but unmistakable. Samantha spun around, her eyes wide. The whisper came again, closer this time. Words she couldn't quite make out, slipping through the air like smoke. It sounded like Jason.
Hello?
Her voice was hoarse, barely a croak, but no one answered. The whispering grew louder, but the words remained just out of reach, like the fleeting memory of a dream. Panic surged through her veins. She backed away, her knees weak, her breath shallow. Her body screamed to run, but she couldn't move. The shadows in the room shifted, and in the dim light, something took form. It was the shape of a man, tall and gaunt, standing in the far corner of the room, staring at her. Samantha's heart stopped. It wasn't Jason, but it wore his face, or rather the semblance of his face, stretched, hollow, like a memory warped by time. The eyes were empty, two dark voids that seemed to suck in all the light around them. And it was smiling.
Sam,
The thing whispered, its voice a sickening mockery of her brother's.
let me in.
She couldn't scream. The sound lodged in her throat as the figure moved toward her, its feet not quite touching the ground. Every step it took seemed to echo through her bones, rattling her very sense of reality.
Why are you doing this?
Samantha finally managed to choke out, her back pressed against the door. Her body shook violently as the thing continued its slow, deliberate advance. The smile widened, unnatural and grotesque.
I'm already inside.
Samantha's eyes flickered to the door behind her, locked, bolted. But the thing wasn't talking about the apartment. It was talking about her. A sharp pain shot through her head, so intense she thought her skull might split open. She collapsed to the floor, clutching her temples as the whispering grew louder, louder, until it wasn't outside her anymore. It was inside her mind. Memories, emotions, fears, everything twisted and distorted, the boundaries of her reality crumbling away like paper in flame. The figure loomed over her, its face now inches from hers, its eyes endless pits of nothingness. And then just as suddenly as it had begun, the pain stopped. Samantha opened her eyes, gasping, her body weak and limp on the cold floor. The room was empty. The figure was gone. But something was different. Something had changed. The phone in her hand buzzed, and she looked down, her stomach churning, as she saw Jason's name flash on the screen. Trembling, she answered.
Sam, let me in.
But this time the voice wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from inside her own head.
2 a.m. the phone starts ringing. His voice comes through, barely breathing. Whispers in the dark, they follow me. Shadows stretch and twist, what do they see? I hear you knocking, but there's no one there. Your voice is close, it's in the air. A figure stands beneath the street lights, looking up, staring through the night. Let me in, let me in. The shadows crawl, where does it begin? Let me in, let me in. Echoes whisper up through the night. In the dark I hear your voice, but in the silence I have no choice. The door is ajar, the chain sways loose. The walls are breathing, they're being pursued. Reality bends, is slipping away. I can't tell the night from the day. I see your name flashing on my phone, but deep inside I know I'm not alone. A shadow moves, it calls my name. This isn't real, but I feel the flame. Let me in, let me in. The shadows crawl, where does it begin? Let me in, let me in. Echoes whisper up through the night. In the dark I hear your voice, but in the silence I have no choice. What is real? What is the lie? Your voice keeps echoing inside. Behind the door, beyond the light, I'm trapped in here, losing the fight. Let me in, let me in. The shadows